Welcome to today's event at this year's Swindon Festival of Literature, which, as a result of restrictions to prevent the spread of that virus, has become a virtual online festival of literature. Thank you very much for joining us, everyone. We do hope that everything is well where you are. We are both pleased and grateful that human ingenuity, cutting-edge science, and digital technology make it possible for this show to go on. Well, at least to go on online. Now, what is the world's fourth largest island? Where in the world is there no evidence of any human life until as recently as 10,000 years ago? And where in the world have you not been? Or maybe you have. Today's guest author has been to more than 80 countries and written 6 books about some of them. His most recent, The Gardens of Mars, Madagascar, an Island Story. And this is it. You'll recognize those trees maybe. Tells of sorcerers, gem prospectors, lemurs, landscapes, the descendants of 17th century pirates, and a great deal more. It's absolutely fascinating. Please join me in giving a Swindon Festival of Literature welcome to today's guest author, prize-winning travel writer, John Gimlette. John, welcome.
Thank you, Matt. That's very kind. It's lovely to be here, and thank you for asking me along to the festival. I'm really looking forward to it. Thank you.
Well, it's great that you're here. Well, you're here online. It's a pity we can't see you live in Swindon in spring, comparable to Paris in spring. You've been here, you've been there, you've been everywhere, but have you ever been to Swindon?
Yes, I have, Matt. I used to be a family lawyer, and I used to come to Swindon many times, so there'll be plenty of people in Swindon who remember me unhappily for their divorces. But yes, I've also been to the festival and I've loved it. So it's great to be back. Thank you.
Terrific, John. And we hope we'll see you again in Swindon. But for now, let's get to the topic in hand online. Your latest book, The Gardens of Mars, Madagascar, an Island Story, which I found quite remarkable, fascinating, thorough. I mean, it has an index, a terrific index, but it also has a further reading section. It's entertaining, it's informative, and even, and this is what I particularly liked, it's thought-provoking. And all of that, I feel, must have taken a lot of what one might call research, although I think of it more as you gathering material, and then a great deal of effort to write. I mean, it's terrific. It's a terrific read for the consumer. But John, what made you do it?
Matt, thank you very much for those kind words. It's very generous of you. Why did I do it? I chose Madagascar because it's been rather neglected over the years. We know a lot about its animals. We've read a lot over the years, and we've seen a lot on the television about its animals. But its people, I always feel, have been rather neglected. And I've always been curious about them. I always see them in the background, in the animal shots, and I always wonder about those people. What are they like? So I did my research. It took about 3 years. And then eventually I was ready to go. And I went for 3 months or so. And the result of all that is this book. And what I want to do today, in the next 20 minutes or so, is try and talk you through Madagascar without slides, but in 10 objects instead. Because one of the advantages of Zoom is we can see things, very small things, very closely. And I thought it might be interesting and intimate for you to look at Madagascar that way. But first of all, what is Madagascar? Well, here you are. This is what it looks like. It looks like a left footprint. But of course, this little map gives you no idea of the scale. Madagascar is vast, the 4th largest island in the world. And from there to there is 1,000 kilometers. So just to give you some idea of what that actually means, if you were to lay this on a map of Europe, it would stretch from London to Algiers. So it's absolutely vast. And yet its road network is shorter than Jamaica's. So travel is very, very challenging indeed. Now, if you were to look at Madagascar in cross-section, it would look like a wedge. So this edge down here is very flat and goes right down to the sea, very dry, particularly here. All the rivers in this part of Madagascar completely dry up during the dry season month. And at the moment, there's a critical famine going on. This side of the country, by contrast, is very steep and very high. There's an escarpment here and it climbs to 5,000 feet, which made it very difficult for people to get from this coast into the interior. And that's part of the story. So how was it formed? Well, let me take you to my first object. So what we have here are some fossils. This is a fossilized Araucana pine, and it's about 280 million years old. And this is an ammonite of a sort of similar age. They're beautiful, beautiful things. These, you can get a good idea of them now. I hope you can see it properly. So 280 million years old. What that means is that these fossils are actually older than Madagascar, the island, because Madagascar only finally reached its current position about 100 million years ago with the breakup of the supercontinent Gondwana. And the last bit of Madagascar to break off was actually India and Sri Lanka. So India and Sri Lanka were here at one stage, and they slid up here, creating this smooth coast before they disappeared off north, crashing into the Asian subcontinent, creating the Himalayas. And from that point onwards, 100 million years ago, Madagascar is an island. So my next object is this. These are some, well, you can see what they are. They're bits of eggshell. And they are eggshell from the largest bird ever to walk this planet. Not so much the tallest, but the biggest in volume and weight and so on. And it was called the elephant bird, or its scientific name is the Apiornis. And it was 10 feet tall, and it lived pretty much all around the south and coasts of Madagascar. In other words, sort of down around here and all the way up to this part of the west coast. Its reputation went before it, and so news of this enormous bird did get back to Europe, probably through Arab traders, and it's even included in Marco Polo's travels. He called it the rook, and he said that it was so big that it was capable of picking up an elephant and flying off with it, and so it got its name, the elephant bird. The truth is a bit more prosaic, because in fact the elephant bird probably became extinct in about 1200, and it probably became extinct due to interaction with human beings through them either hunting it or burning down its habitat. So these little bits of eggshell, if you were to glue them together, and you do find them in fossil shops occasionally, if you were to glue enough of them together to make an egg, it costs you about £4,500. If you were to find a complete one, and there are a few, there's one at Stowe School, for example, it would cost you about £60,000. So these are very, very rare and special to find them in this country. In Madagascar, they're everywhere. All along the south coast, there are tons and tons and tons of this stuff. So there it is. That's my second object. My third object is this little pot. I hope you can see it all right. It's made of aluminium. It's a very, very simple little thing. This one is actually sold as a souvenir, but the Malagasys do make these pots much bigger. You can get them up to 200 litres for making a simply vast curry. You could almost have a bath in one of these pots. And the reason that I want to show you this pot is that here is a clue to some of the earliest people, the earliest settlers in Madagascar. And here's the really incredible thing. Madagascar is only 240 miles from the African mainland, but the first successful settlers didn't come from Africa. They came from all the way the other side of the Indian Ocean, 3,700 miles away in Borneo. And we know that because the Malagasy language is almost identical to the language of a little valley in Borneo, on the Indonesian island of Kalimantan. One valley speaks almost the same language as Madagascar. And there's something like an 80% congruency between the two languages. And the result of all of that is that living in the center of Madagascar are people who look Asian. They look Indonesian. They speak an Indonesian language, and they grow rice. And the importance of this pot is their smelting, because these people came across the Indian Ocean, bringing with them ancestor worship, rice cultivation, all those sort of things, but also smelting. And the particular smelting that's done there is used with a double bellows. And the only other place in the world that this double bellows is found is Kalimantan. So how did these people get here? Nobody knows. Why did they come here? Nobody knows. Exactly when did they come here? Nobody really knows. All we do know is that they were settled, and the most successful settlers, by about the time of Christ, although earlier waves of them had come much earlier, about 8000 BC. And we know that they settled around the time of Christ because they didn't bring Hinduism with them, but they did bring iron smelting. And therefore that helps us time it in relation to the history of Indonesia. So that's your first really strange thing about Madagascar. The next item I want to show you is this. And this is also key in the history of Madagascar. It's called a Vongavanga. This is not a very good specimen because it's only partially silver. A proper Vongavanga, or one of these bracelets, should be made of solid silver. And what it will be as solid silver is melted down Mexican reals. And the reason for that is slavery. So the first slaves were probably picked up in Madagascar in the 7th or 8th century by Arab traders. And we know this because they started appearing in the markets of Zanzibar. Arab traders bought guns eventually, and the slave trade took off. And it became an internal slave trade as well. In other words, the dominant tribe in the center, the Merina, that's the Indonesian-looking people, started capturing African-looking people who'd started arriving on the coast and taking them back there. And by 1900, they were about 1 million Afro-Malagasys living up in the highlands. And that makes this mix of population that you see today, part Asian, part African looking. And this Vongavanga is symbolic, perhaps, of that great period of slavery. Now, of course, at some stage, as we all know, the Europeans got involved in this from about the 17th century onwards. And from about 1720 to 1820, about 100,000 slaves were taken to the New World. But even before that, slaves were taken. And so, for example, in Barbados in 1680, half the slave population were Malagasys. And they were regarded as very good slaves because they were intelligent, creative, very good at making things, and so on. So there it is. It's a sad relic of that time, but it's part of the bitter payment that Madagascar has had to pay for its interactions with the outside world. Okay, the next thing I want to show you is this. So this is a manhunter's spear. And this particular example is new. I actually came back from Madagascar with 3 spears. 2 of them look rather grotty and rusty, but this one is brand new. And the reason I wanted to show you a new one is just to illustrate that these things are still made. This is still a tool for a job in Madagascar. And what's it for? Well, it's not for wild animals. And the reason for that is because there's only one wild animal in Madagascar that's dangerous, and that's the Nile crocodile. Everything else, all the other animals, are broadly speaking harmless. There aren't even any poisonous snakes in the whole of Madagascar. So what's this for? The answer is it's for hunting men. And it's all about a low-grade war that continues all the time in Madagascar, and it's all about cattle. So when I was traveling around in the hinterlands of Madagascar, I would often see these militias of villagers going around armed with these. And what they're doing is they're hunting down the rustlers. There's 11 million cattle in Madagascar, and there's a bitter conflict, as it were, between villagers and bandits called Dahal over those cattle. And so villagers set up these militias, and off they go with these. And I said to them, well, what happens if you catch the Dahal? And they said, well, we kill them. And I said, don't you tell the police? And they said, no, if we told the police, then they'd be taken into custody. The boss would come along, pay a bribe, and they'd be out again, they'd come and kill us. So we don't tell them, we kill them, we douse them in petrol. That's the end of it, end of story. Now, I should hasten to add, this low-grade war isn't a threat to you or I as tourists. It's all about cattle. We're invisible. They don't even see us. And I often came across the militias walking along the riverbanks as we were making our way downriver in a boat, all perfectly harmless, but armed with these things. Okay, the next item I want to show you is some battlefield junk. And what it is pieces of porcelain, pottery, broken glass, belt buckles, and so on. And the story here relates to the French invasion of Madagascar in 1895. So up until that point, Europeans had been unable to make any inroads at all into Madagascar in terms of settling it. The Welsh had been there since 1820, bringing Christianity, but they never really, or at least the British government had never wanted to settle it. Our ambition was simply to keep the French out. In 1895, that all changed. And the French arrived in 1895 and did this crazy march across the country. So they landed about here, and they tried to march to the capital here, about 500 kilometers through the bush, building a road as they went. They set out with 18,000 troops. Along the way, 9,000 died of black water fever and malaria and so on, and only 25 died in combat. Now, part of this book is about not only writing the history or reporting the history of this country, but also going to the places where these things happen and bringing them to life. So I went to this place called Maivetanana, where I knew the Malagasys had made a stand against the French, and I knew that they'd sighted their guns on a high bit of land. So I climbed up there, climbed up onto this buttress of rock, several kilometers outside the village, and I thought, I wonder if I'm in the right place. And I started scrabbling away, and sure enough, in the soil was all this stuff. Some of it's European, some of it, like this one, I know to be Malagasy made, and the belt buckles, who knows. And why some of it European? Because some of the officers were European. In fact, they were ex-British Army veterans of the Zulu War in the employment of the Malagasy Queen. So this was a great moment for me to start scrabbling away at the ground and to find these little chunks of pottery and to know that I was in the right place, and this is where the battle had happened back then in June 1895. All right, so moving on to my seventh item. The French occupation of Madagascar only lasted until 1960. They made, in many ways, very little impression on this country, building some roads, canals and so on, and a few little sprigs of railway. It was never a happy occupation, and one of the unhappiest chapters of it was the Second World War, when the French administration was taken over by Vichy. Churchill was very concerned about this, and so he launched an amphibious landing. It was our first amphibious landing since the Gallipoli campaign. Our troops had to sail 9,000 miles around the world. They did their training for Madagascar on Loch Fyne in Scotland, trying to pretend that it was a sort of Madagascar. Anyway, they set off. When they got to South Africa, they realized they would have to waterproof their vehicles. They bought all the Bostik that was available in South Africa to waterproof their vehicles. And then this crazy landing went ahead right up here in the very north of Madagascar in Diego Soares. And no one knew whether this would succeed, but it did. And amongst those to land were the South Lanks Regiment, who fought with distinction in a two-day battle against the Vichy French. The war was very short, the battle was very short-lived. Something like 100 Allied troops were killed in the entire campaign, and about 350 Vichy French also. But amazingly, the Allied forces prevailed, and 8,000 prisoners were taken. And for the first time, Madagascar fell into British hands, and the BBC was broadcast from Tanna. An extraordinary chapter in the history of Madagascar. You may ask, why did they bother doing it? Churchill feared that Diego Soares would fall into the hands of the Japanese and would be used as a submarine base and might have altered the course of the war. Anyway, it didn't happen. My next exhibit for you is a magic cure. Well, sort of a magic cure. For most Malagasys, who are some of the poorest people in the world, there is no conventional medicine. I think there's only one CT scanner in the whole of Madagascar, and there's no neurosurgeon at all. So most people are reliant on either magic or traditional cures. And this one is actually ylang ylang, but it was sold to me as a cure for hypertension and also as an aphrodisiac. Quite useful to have the two in one medicine. Anyway, there it is. And it's funny, when I first went to Madagascar, I was so naive about it. I went with my wife and she was 4 months pregnant. If I knew now what I knew, if I knew then what I know now, there's no way I'd have done that. But anyway, fortunately, we didn't have any antenatal adventures and weren't reliant on a little bottle of ylang ylang like this. But it does show you that things are still quite difficult for a lot of Malagasys. In this present COVID crisis, they've coped quite well with it, but the president has announced that there won't be a vaccine. Instead, there will be a special sort of COVID tea, which the government is growing out in the jungle, and this is being produced for everybody, and he says it will save the world. Well, we'll just have to see about that. My penultimate exhibit for you is a tear gas grenade. And the story here is a sad one, and I'm afraid it's really all too common in a way. Madagascar in the last 20 years has been politically very unstable, with several coups and changes of government. When I was there was a planned demonstration in the town centre in Antananarivo. And it was planned against the government because the government had wanted to bring in some constitutional changes, change the age of candidates for the next election, and to also insist that they be resident. And this was to wipe out two candidates, one of whom was in exile, I got rid of him, and the other whom was 44, and they wanted the age of presidency to be 45. Anyway, there were gales of protest about this, and everybody started converging on the central town. I was in two minds as to whether to go down there, and then I thought, no, I must. This is history in the making, and Malagasy friends encouraged me to go. They said, no, you must go and report it. And it turned out to be probably one of the most terrifying days of my life, but also, and I feel guilty saying this, but also very exhilarating. So what happened is, from my vantage point slightly above the demonstration, I could see tires being set on fire and then tear gas grenades. And then the army started using birdshot against the crowd just to sort of keep them back. The crowd was much bigger than them and they were soon overwhelmed. And in their panic, the army opened fire with AKs. And you could see, certainly on the TV shots later, you can see the crowd being cut down and something like 80 people were injured and 4, sadly, were killed. It was terrifying because I just never knew where this riot was going to go next. But I also found in myself a sort of curiosity to want to get down into the crowd, and I did. And there I was, the only white face in this crowd. And as long as I said, look, I'm British, I'm not French, they distrust the French. As long as you said that, people were very happy for me to be there. And on the ground, I picked up one of these French-made bombe lacrymogène tear gas grenades. So it's a poignant reminder of a really terrible day in Madagascar's history, but one that in a strange way I'm glad I was there for. The last of my exhibits is rather happier. And for those of you who've been to Madagascar, this will be a familiar item. So what it is, it's a beautiful model of a little Citron car, and it's made out of an aerosol tin. And the reason that I've shown you this is partly because those of you who've been there will be familiar with this, but also because it's a mark of the ingenuity of the Malagasy people. They are very adaptable and ingenious at making things, and this will inform their future. Already call centers are being set up there where something like 5,000 people are answering calls from Morocco and France, dealing with Deliveroo complaints or Marie Claire subscriptions. The other thing they're doing is data processing. And this, in a sense, is going to be their future. there will be 50,000 people working in this country on data processing. And I love the idea that when people ring up in France with their furious complaints about their delivery or whatever, they'll be answered by a Malagasy who will respond to them with infinite charm. And it's this lovely idea that this country that once exported slaves is now exporting its charm and happiness for all. So I hope that you get a chance to get there and share in some of that ingenuity and happiness. Matt.
John, thank you very much. And beautifully, even though this is unrehearsed, it really does lead to the first thing I want to ask you about. Gertrude Stein said, "A people is as their land and their air is," implying that, you know, maybe in the far northern hemisphere, people are cool and detached and reserved, and that towards the tropics, people are warmer and more tactile and so on. And I wonder if in your travels, you found that, but most particularly, because we're talking about Madagascar, whether you can say something about whether there is such a thing as the typical Malagasy, the Madagascan person, pre-French and others. In other words, you know, I know you've been to Paraguay, you've been around South America and so on, and you know, one sees a certain way of being in people that feels rooted in their past, even though they may have mobile phones and so on. Now, is there something that can be said about the people of Madagascar that speaks about their origins?
Yeah, there are two things, really. One is that Asian origins come across very strongly. So Malagasy this is in two ways. There's a certain inbuilt subservience almost. They're very happy to be led by others. The second thing is they are very coy about their religion and very coy about telling you anything about it. They are notionally Christian. I mentioned the Welsh missionaries who came there and converted the country, a remarkable feat. I won't go into it now. Between 1820 and 1828, almost the entire country was converted by 12 Welsh missionaries. They are notionally Christian, but actually, in common with almost all Malagasys, whatever they are of the 18 tribes, there is ancestor worship. And Malagasys don't like trying to explain this to you, but essentially what's going on is their lives are guided by the dead. And everything a Malagasy does is guided by thinking, would my ancestors approve of this? Am I doing the right thing, or am I going to make them angry? That's one thing. The second thing is, I must be near the family tomb when I die. So I must be in my village. So if I'm abroad and die, my family must bring my body back to the tomb. And the reason for that is the family tomb is the portal to the afterlife. If you don't make it to the family tomb, you drift the highlands, this ghostly spirit forever. So the tomb is really important. And Malagasys are really surprised by the way we in the West spend so much money on our houses and so little on our tomb. They have this lovely expression there: a house is a voyage, a tomb is forever. So these are things, to answer your question, these are things that have always been there ever since they brought their Asian ancestry with me. And in a sense, they haven't changed. If anything, colonialism has made them a little bit more coy about it. But as we get further and further away from the colonial period, perhaps the true Malagasy is beginning to emerge again.
Yeah. Thanks, John. And allied to that is, because this is what travelers who are maybe just unprofessional travelers, tourists, like I sat in an armchair and read this book and I was there. And I kept thinking of myself being there and thinking, how would I get on with this landscape? And how would I get on with these people? Now, you've answered about the people, and I kind of like them. I wish they weren't so poor, or why the people themselves are so poor. And I see 4x4s in the photographs there, and I hear what the French and so on and others have done. But what about, and you're not promoting tourism, far from it, but I still want to ask the question, how at home does a man like you feel in the extremes of Madagascar, because each side is different to the other? How did you feel at home in that environment?
Matt, I didn't feel at home, no. And in a sense, that's what's to be rejoiced. It's the difference between our landscapes and our people that I so enjoy about this. It is an utter escapism for any of us to go there. I've talked about the people are so different in the way they think about things. The landscapes are so different to anything that you've probably experienced before. Amazing features like singis, which singis are these limestone pinnacles all packed together. You just won't see anything like that anywhere else in the world, that have their own environment underneath them and within them in caves. Beautiful islands, escarpments, jungles, dry areas of cactus and thorn where people live there in this seemingly waterless area, and you wonder how they survive. It's a very, very tough environment for a lot of people, and I find it utterly alien and utterly enjoyable. But no, I don't identify with it at all. And I think Europeans have always found this country really difficult. As I said, they couldn't settle there until the end of the century. And only perhaps the combustion engine and antibiotics enables them to go there now. But if you do go there, you will love it. It is just an extraordinary experience.
And just going back to the people, they live there and they're happy there. And in fact, didn't they come out in some world survey as second only to the Paraguayans, or even first as happiest, in single inverted commas, people in the world? And why would that be if you found the climate tricky on the landscape and the people are partially oppressed by outsiders? Where does this happiness score come from?
It's a mystery, isn't it, really? Madagascars are desperately poor, most of them, as I mentioned. In Tanna, they live on an average of €2 a day. And they have this lovely expression, delight is not for the poor. Only in sleep do we resemble the rich. And what that betrays is the fact that they feel this is normal. It'll always be like that, and there's nothing you can do with it, and you just live with it. And when I found it really difficult to get used to the poverty. You know, when you see a sort of bank window, the window of a bank at night with 6 children asleep, curled up in the window, homeless children, it's quite difficult to get used to that. I don't think I ever did, but what I did do is learn to look beyond it. And Madagascar has always encouraged us to do that. They said, we're poor, but it doesn't define us. We're not made up of poverty. We're much more than that. And so they encourage you to enjoy them and to enjoy their country, and not just to see the poverty. It helps for them that this life isn't the real thing. This is only a dry run for the afterlife. And so they'll tell you, this life doesn't really matter. As long as you keep the ancestors happy here, it's the next life through the portal. That's what really matters.
I want to spend a bit more time on this question of an English person reading this book and thinking, would I want to go there? And you are an interesting person insofar as you are a tourist in one sense, because you don't live there, but in another sense, you're never quite at ease in touristic hotspots. You know, there you were in Nosy Be. You bring your family towards the end of your trip there, and there are other people enjoying themselves. And there's some unease that I feel in you about being in other people in another country, and it's not that you're uneasy about your own behavior, but there's something about what one does when one goes to another country, and the other side of that is whether you were ever frightened. And you mentioned that at one point about the militia people trying to stop people stealing zebu cattle. But there's more to be frightened of, and you weren't frightened of those because they were fine. But more and more people don't see themselves, and Swindon has a very discerning festival followers. And many, I know from previous travel writers that we have, many people people who like to read and so on, and like to see the world in a particular way, don't see themselves as typical tourists. There's nothing wrong with typical tourists, but they actually think of travel as part of their learning process and part of part of being more empathetic towards other cultures, and so on and so forth, diversity, and all these things that are spoken about. And that's part of it. So could you say something about how you felt generally in terms of fear,
sure.
excitement, pleasure? Where was the balance between those sort of things?
Okay, so there are obviously very different ways of seeing Madagascar, and I've done both, because the first trip that I went there, I went as a press trip, and that was for tourists, and I stayed in tourist places, and I have to say I loved it. I'm not aloof from other tourists or other Brits or particularly Italians and French, which is what the majority of tourists are. But when I went back for this trip, this 3-month trip, then I had to get away from tourists, because if I was to learn about Madagascar, I wasn't going to learn about it where there were other people who speak my language and think the same way as me. I had to get amongst Madagascar. So there was a conscious effort to get away, with, as you say, one exception, Matt, when my wife and 16-year-old daughter came out to join me for 3 weeks or so of it to explore the north. And that was revealing in itself, to see Madagascar all over again through their eyes. And I really enjoyed that. But no, when I'm by myself, I'm in areas where there probably aren't tourists, because I'm looking for particular things. It may be battlefields, it may be animals, it may be a story about child abuse, which is something that I wanted to cover in this. And sure, some of it's physically uncomfortable. Most of the time I traveled by taxi, Bruce. Some of it is not frightening, but it does make you a bit anxious, particularly travel by road sometimes, because there's lots of stories of holdups and so on. So I was definitely anxious, sometimes a little bit frightened, because some of the areas were worse than others. But I should hasten to add that stories of crime tend to get a bit exaggerated in Madagascar. They think, very much like the Paraguayans do, that their crime is out of control. They don't know what it's like to live in London. And we're used to crime and we take normal precautions. I actually don't think the crime in Madagascar was particularly bad at all. It's just very well publicized and really feared by the locals. But yeah, there were undoubtedly anxious moments, but most of the time I felt pretty comfortable. I am, as you hinted at, I'm uncomfortable with some aspects of travel with Europeans, and in particular, that in relation to the abuse of children. It's a really big problem there. I hope I've thrown a little bit of light on it, and I hope that where all of us get a chance to do something about it, donations to charity or whatever, then we can. It's just dreadful.
Well, that was one of the things that made me feel this book was very thought-provoking on all sorts of levels. But we're coming close to the end, and I want to ask you a sort of a lighter question. I mean, why do you don't spend much time on baobab trees, and you spend a bit of time on lemurs, but why do Europeans go soft on lemurs and these certain creatures and flora and fauna of Madagascar? What's going on there?
Matt, you're right. I haven't spent a huge proportion of this book on either the baobabs or the lemurs. The reason for that is because I wanted to tell the people's story, and you can't tell the people's story without reference to lemurs and baobabs, because they're all interrelated. But the focus is on people. That's not to say that I didn't really enjoy the baobabs, these gorgeous trees that look as though they've been drawn by children and planted upside down, just extraordinary bits of flora. And I also enjoyed the fauna as well. There are something like 130 wild mammals in this species of wild mammals in Madagascar, and only one of them are found elsewhere, and that's the bats. Everything else is unique to Madagascar. All those lemurs, the tenrecs, which are like little hedgehogs, fast breeding hedgehogs, all of this stuff is unique. Why do we like it? Partly because it's so unique. It's also very cute. There's no denying the cuteness of lemurs. They're almost human, and they're fluffy. They're like sort of teddy bears in the trees, really. It's quite extraordinary. The Malagasys don't see them quite like that. Many Malagasys have never seen a lemur. Some of them regard them as lunch, and others regard them as ancestors lost in the forest. So it rather depends where you are in the country what approach you have. Not all tourists like them either. Europeans love lemurs. Chinese tourists, not interested in them at all. Would rather have a look at a baobab tree than a lemur. I don't understand that, but it's an interesting trait of the difference between us.
Yeah, and there are more than 100 species of them, so they're all different types. So there are lots of different lemurs to see. This book is brilliantly illustrated as well. So not only is it a good read, but they're terrific pictures. And sometimes travel books are a bit predictable in their pictures. It has maps to tell you where you are. You can read any chapter on its own, and it tells you a story of its own, which makes it very good to have somewhere handy to pick up and read a chapter at a time. And not apart from photographs, it also has some intriguing little, they look like pencil or wash drawings. And I was thinking, is this the author? Tell us more about that very eye-catching, but very subtle, down in the right-hand corner.
Well, that's very kind of you, Matt. Yes, I do a little bit of sketching along the way around. It just brings it to life. It's a bit more immediate to do sketches rather than just solid photographs. And I've always done them for my books. So they're just little thumbnail sketches of people or animals around the place. Yeah, but I've added a few.
Yeah. But it makes this a really comprehensive book, you know, from the writing, from the historic detail. It's a fat book, folks, but I couldn't put it down and I had other things to do. And talking of which, we have to finish now, but it would be lovely to let festival followers and others hear a little bit from the book. I wonder if you would be happy to read, and I have a suggestion of a passage because it ends with a beautiful sentence, which is on page 318, but I'm springing that on you, unless you have a passage of your choice.
No, Matt, I'd be delighted to read that passage. So this is about part of the journey down the eastern escarpment. I stopped in a place called Andasibe, which is an old railway junction. And there is an amazing lemur there, the largest of the lemurs, and it's described here. Defiance was everywhere in the hills around Andasibe. This time, however, it wasn't topography or humans, but a kind of lemur. The Indri would rather die than change. Although it's the largest of the lemurs and looks like a child in fluffy pajamas, it lives only in this eastern forest. It never goes anywhere, never adapts, and never eats anything but leaves. Even though it's completely defenseless, it has a call like an air raid siren, piquing appetites for miles around. But it resists all attempts to move it or hold it, and whenever it's caged, it stubbornly dies. No one has ever owned an Indri for more than a month. The last attempt to get them to Europe was in 1939, when 10 appeared in Paris and immediately perished. At dawn, I got up to listen to the daily challenge. All around, the forest wailed and hooted as the Indris rebuilt their boundaries out of noise. Andasibe and its little stations were easily overwhelmed by this deluge of sound. But Indris weren't just sopranos, they were also ancestors. You had to be careful, said one of the station's old watchmen. If you ever attacked them with spears, they'd throw them back with deadly force. And that, he smiled, is why the French never touched them. I walked back to the village in search of a bus. One day, all this might change. The songs might stop and the forest might shrink away. But for now, things are as they've always been. And here's Madagascar at its obstinate best.
John Gimlette, the Swindon Festival of Literature, says thank you very much for appearing at our festival, even though it's online, and we look forward to welcoming you back to Swindon one day. But for now, many thanks, John.
Matt, thank you very much. Delightful to be back in Swindon on this happy occasion. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you so much. Goodbye.